Haley, yeah. Yeah, I'm doing well. Yeah, we're getting things all organized again. I'm back building. Yeah, I promise this time it'll be different. I am definitely going to get my build in on time. I've got all the castings for the rest of the year already, so we're all set. I've got to jump on everything. I got the van, I got the Porsche, I got the hauling gas, I got the Caprice, I got the Chevy 2 for this month. Yeah, the Chevy 2. It's the same thing as the Nova. It's the 66 Nova. It's not the Chevy 2. You're sure? Well, son of a...
Hey there folks, Chuck here, and wow, I do not have a lot of time before this video is due, so we're going to dive right in and snap to the disassembly of this Nova. Fun fact about the 1966 Chevy Nova, it is a completely different car from the 1963 Chevy 2, which is what I had and I thought was the same thing as the casting for this month's build. It is not the same thing, so I had to move fast, and fortunately, despite all the madness that's going on, there are still good people on eBay that ship things at a reasonable schedule. So I dove right in. I wanted to do a formal test out of the Vallejo rust staining and streaking set that I demonstrated a little bit of in my GTO build. This was a good chance for me to walk all the way through that. But before I got to that, I had to do the prep, do the stripping, and I wanted to give this kind of a good used street machine look. And I really couldn't get around the fiberglass hood on this car. I had to work with this casting because I really didn't have a lot of time to do a lot of body modifications. But I wanted to give it a good weather-beaten Street Fighter look. Give it the Street Fighter look that all the attention has been paid to the mechanics of this car and not so much to the cosmetic side. A couple of pieces of trim were missing. Once the barrel grinder had been used, I used some 400 grit sandpaper to smooth everything over. I did a quick go around with the round handle needle files to round off all of the casting lines. I decided not to go too crazy on the denting for this car because I wanted to focus more on the paint finish from the Vallejo set that I'm going to be reviewing. So I gave it one good ding on the fender and a couple of bits of gnarled rust on the lower quarter panels and lower fenders. I noticed on my reference photos where the gas cap was on these Novas, and I really wanted to have it look like this car was owned by maybe not the most careful of owners and they had misplaced the gas cap. So in order for there to be a missing gas cap, there needed to be a hole where that gas cap would have gone. All it takes is a pop of the drill punch and a quick drill with a 16th inch bit and you're good to go. I had scuffed the body pretty good with all of the sandpapering, but I wanted to make sure I went over everything with a brass brush on the Dremel to make sure the body was burnished properly before going into primer and paint. I had a little help from my assistant here. She is a big fan of the auto punch, and while she was playing with the auto punch, I was making a rear view mirror out of an extra set of axles that I had lying around. I've seen this done by several other builders where they bend the axle and use the cap of the axle for the mirror, and that works well with these 1960s American cars. Just wanted to have holes where the trim would have gone in the doors and fenders that were missing trim, so I taped a guideline with some masking tape and drilled some holes to simulate where the trim would have attached to the body of the car. I hadn't done a green car yet, and I know green is bad luck for racing, but the way I was doing this car, maybe the owner of this car didn't have the best luck already. I went with a green on green because I haven't really done a green car or a green interior, and I kind of like that monochromatic look, especially with green cars. I mean, green and tan is a classic look, but I wanted to do more monochrome style interior this time around. With the racing seats, there's something that would be a little mismatched to an otherwise stock interior. They got a little contrasting tarnished black. I also wanted to go lighter on the chassis this go around. I went with railroad tie brown as the base, but then immediately lightened it up with some tarnished black and some lighter colors to make it look a little less dark. If you look at the actual underside of like a flipped car, it's usually nowhere near as dark as you would think it would be. It's a lot more gritty grays and browns and tans and rust. This was my first time playing with modulation on the body. I've seen this done before where you take a Scotch-Brite pad and you tear it in half and you tear it in half again and you end up with like this fine random pattern, and I really wanted to play with modulation before I got into the weathering set. I started with Vallejo olive green, which turned out way too dark. It was not what I think of when I think of olive green, but I'm not really an armor builder, and maybe real olive green is not what everybody else thinks of when they think of olive green. So this was really a mix of olive green, yellow, white, and a bit of gray to dull it down. And I started with the darker color at the base and worked my way up to what is more gray than green, honestly, at the top, and used the Scotch-Brite pad to modulate the lightest colors as I went back over the entire car to give it a little bit of a mottled finish. And then I took what was left of the green and went around the outside of the interior so it blended a little bit more. The craft paint that I used was obviously a very different olive green than what I had concocted by mixing a bunch of stuff together. So again, here's the chassis, a lot lighter than I usually go, but because of the forced shadow that I was going with the darker green contrast, I wanted the chassis to be a little bit on the lighter side, and gave it a little touch from the Tamiya weathering powders to add some rust and a little bit of silver in spots to highlight the aftermarket mufflers. And of course, the Chevy orange engine would have a little bit of orange underneath it. Once again, my little helper came in, and she loves orange, so she grabbed my mixing stick and decided to decorate my workspace a little bit. I wasn't going to add the rearview mirror until the very end. While it was sitting there, I hit it with the Maltau chrome pin so that when it was time to add it, it would be dry and ready to go, because Maltau pins take forever to dry. Hey, remember that missing gas cap? Well, it was finally time to add that classic missing gas cap solution, the wadded up rag. I took some Sculpey souffle clay, just took a teeny tiny amount, smashed it flat, rolled it thin, smashed it flat again, worked it with a toothpick to get it into the opening that I had made, and gave it a few touches with the fine point of the toothpick to make it look like a rag. Stuck the whole thing in my food dehydrator for about half an hour, and that did a good job of hardening up the clay. It gets to about 200 degrees in there, which is perfect for drying out baked to dry clay. Dip the windshield in the pickle jar for a little bit of Pledge Future polish. Fun fact, it's not actually polish, it is basically just a gloss acrylic that you throw on your floor. Maltau pen is out again and doing all of the shiny bits on the front of the car. I actually really enjoy working with the 2mm pen a lot more than the 1mm. It doesn't seem to have the leaking issues that the 1mm pen has. I wanted the hood to have a little bit of a faded appearance, so I mixed a little bit of black into some gray. I did not go with a straight black because, again, I try to avoid using straight black and straight white as much as possible, just because in nature that almost never shows up, especially on a weathered vehicle. There's fading and there's darkening and there's staining. I did have to resort to the 1mm pen in a few spots just to get into the little nooks and crannies. I have two of them now. I can tell which one is the good pen because it does not have chrome ink leaking all over it. The ATSF red is a perfect dull red for imitating those throwaway rags that you get at the auto parts store. Because the Maltau pen dries so slowly, even with the food dehydrator, I give myself a lot of time between the trim on the front of the car and the trim on the back and around the windows. So I usually do those in 3 separate steps. That's why you'll see those interspersed through my builds more than me doing all the trim at once. I painted in some seat belts with some orange paint and gave them a few chrome buckles, and once everything had dried, I gave the interior a good brown wash to add a little bit of grime to it. It was time to give the car a shot of matte varnish. I still airbrushed the matte coat on the body even though it really doesn't show brush strokes, but just to be safe, I still airbrush it on. I use the brush on the chassis. The chassis is a lot more forgiving, and just brushed on some matte clear to dull up the wheels and tires before I got to actual weathering. I really liked how the Gundam pen made the panels stand out on this green finish. It went on really well. This casting is great. Panel lines are really deep in it, so it's very easy to have them stand out. This was a really nice casting to work with, all things considered. Again, the black seemed a little bit too contrasty, so I went over the black panel lines with the brown. Some oyster white craft paint for the headlights. Craft paint is great for doing headlights because it's thicker than most paints, so you get this good surface tension and it creates a natural dome to the headlights as you put them in. It does dry very flat though, so you have to go over them again with gloss to get that glass headlight shine, but for the effort and a bottle of paint being basically $1, it's hard to go wrong with craft paint for doing headlights. And a little Tester's transparent orange for the turn signals, and the oyster white back at it again for the backup lights, and some Tester's transparent red for the taillights. Before I dove fully into the weathering, it was time to attach the rearview mirror, and that was as simple as putting some CA glue on the inside and snapping off the excess metal after it dried. And with that out of the way, it was time to dive into the rust stain and streaking set from Vallejo that I bought to get me out of weathering jazz hell. It tells you exactly by the numbers what to do when it comes to rust, stain, and streaking, hence the title. And I decided to do just that and take it step by step and share the process with you. So here we go.
Step 1A, chipping light base.
To create chipping and the start of the staining and streaking process, start with mottled color, German camouflage black-brown. To create more realistic chipping effects, it's best to start by applying chipping using any light base color, in this case, Deck Tan. I think it's interesting that they suggest using Deck Tan, but didn't actually include Deck Tan in with the kit. I ended up using the green that I used to airbrush the car and just adding a little more white to it to lighten it up.
Step 1B, chipping with black brown and chocolate brown.
Next, add the dark chipping using a fine tip brush, allowing for some light colored chipping to show around the edges of the darker chipping. Depending on the model base color and personal preference, the model color, chocolate brown, can be used instead of the German camo black brown. The beauty of working with acrylics and working at this small a scale is by the time I was done painting the light colored chips, everything was dry and ready for me to go over with the German camo black brown and the chocolate brown. So the first step was going over everything with the black brown, and then I did a little bit of touch up with the chocolate brown to add some modulation in the larger chips.
Step 2. Accent chips and rust transition.
To accent the chipped paint and rust transition, Panzer Ace's Light Rust is applied with a fine tip paintbrush. Using a dampened, wide, flat brush, we stump this freshly applied paint so the contrast is not too overpowering. This one's where the chips really start to come alive. It was really cool to see the black-brown mix with the rust color and start to really look like corroded metal. But even though these are designed more for armor, I still like the look that this gave the car, and it really only gets better from here.
Step 3. Staining chipped areas.
This step starts the staining of the chipped areas as well as the blending of the previous step. For staining, we use bright colors, model color orange brown and model orange air rust. This bright rust staining is applied over the chipped area and around the chip onto the base paint. While still fresh, the wide damp brush is again used to stump and blend the stain. It is best to work a small amount at a time and always keeping the stumping brush clean and damp to wet. Like the instructions said, this was much more about staining, and once I got into it, I realized that once then down, these paints created this really nice wash that really started to tint the car with surface rust starting to show through look that you would see on an older paint job, and I really liked how that looked, so I went a little off script here and started doing a little preemptive rust wash on the top of the car. I also took advantage of some of the darker colors to add some fuel stains to the rag, and then just went over the side of the car with the dampened brush to start adding some streaking effects. Again, the beauty of this kit is that for $20, you're working with one drop of paint at a time. I think the most drops of paint I used from any of these was the rust wash at the end, and I think I used 4 drops of paint on the whole car. So yeah, again, this kit is a bit overkill for 1/64th scale. The details would stand out more on a 1/35th scale or larger build. I like how this kit made me think about rust and corrosion, and it was really a nice way to get me to think methodically about my weathering rather than just randomly going, oh, well, there needs to be rust here and a wash there, and then having to go back over stuff. This step-by-step layout that allowed me to freehand what I wanted to do, but still kind of gave me a structure to go more in terms of layers than what I want the final effect to be and reverse engineer it.
Step 4. Rust stains.
With the same 2 colors, water is used to thin them in order to create rust stains in corners where water is pooled and the rust stained the paint. This can be applied with a brush or by masking the surrounding area and using a fine-tipped airbrush at low pressure. I ended up not using an airbrush at all when it came to weathering because, again, I was pressed for time, and there really wasn't a lot of areas on this car where rust would pool just by the design of the sheet metal on the car. There was a part on this step that I skipped, which says to create fresher rust, model air wood can be used with either a brush or an airbrush as one of the other bright rust tones. It did come with the wood paint, but I didn't use it. I'm going to try that on a future build, maybe. I did try to get areas on a car where moisture from rain and dew would settle on a car. I also added a little bit of extra orange to the base of the car where rust along the quarter panels and rockers would be.
Step 5. Streaking and staining. Light and dark.
For streaking and staining, the light and dark colors can be used, as well as mixing a different shade of rust color. This is lightly thinned and can be applied with a round or flat brush. It is also a good idea to do random colored streaks. The streaking technique is the same as the one used in oil paints. It is important not to overdo this step and keep the stain streaking subtle. Further staining can be done later. This was the part that I had been waiting on, is adding the streaks, especially along the holes in the body where the trim had been removed. Because this is a stain and streaking set, I wanted this car to look like it came from a humid environment or an area where there would be a lot of water that would allow the rust to travel. I was originally thinking of a southern car, but I ended up going a little different direction.
Step 6. Precise streaking.
Smaller or more precise streaking can be done using the German camouflage black brown or the chocolate brown colors. Here we use Panzer Ace's dark rust. Using a round brush and a dampened flat brush, start by making a vertical line. Before the paint dries, lightly and in a vertical motion, draw and blend the streak up or down. Be sure to wet and remove paint and excess water before and after each blending. At the top of the streak, where the chip is, paint can be further stumped with a damp brush to blend the streak color. This step was also a lot of fun to make the actual hard streaking lines on spots of the car that would have really had a lot of moisture and time. I gave it a little bit of forced shadow with that German black brown as well under the trim to make that area look a little more three-dimensional. I really didn't realize how much I was missing by not using nice paints. I didn't really realize how far the paint game had come until I finally started investing in some of the Citadel and Vallejo paints. And you can do some amazing stuff with craft paints, don't get me wrong. It's just you have to work with them more, and sometimes it's just nice to be able to open a bottle of paint and immediately put it in the airbrush and go, or immediately put it on the palette and go, and not have to worry too much about the chemistry of thinning it out a certain amount. For the tight schedule that I was on for this build, it was nice to have that available to me.
Step 7. Final staining.
The final step is to apply a thin layer of staining that will help blend all the previous colors. This step can be done with or instead of using the streak staining in step 5. Both combined give a more layered effect and depth. Using small amounts of the light rust wash, small amounts of rust are worked into the stains already applied. For the streaking, a flat brush is used with a small amount of wash and the stain is applied in a downward motion. Any excess can be removed with a flat brush. So yeah, they advocated some more moderate application of the rust wash than I ended up going with. I really started out wanting to do a more subtle wash, but I really liked how this looked with the green, and I ended up just doing it over the entire car and going over it again in a few spots to increase the contrast of the rust wash, especially along the roof of the car, where there would be more wear and tear on the paint from years of the sun beating down on it. Once I had applied so much rust over the top of the car, I realized the chassis really needed rust wash, and that really helps tie it all together. I also gave the bumpers a little touch of the rust wash at the base to simulate pitting and the corrosion that you get on cheap chrome once the chrome starts to break down and flake off on the base of the bumper. Well, that's that, the Vallejo Rust, Stain, and Streaking set. I really enjoyed working with this set. It's fun to do your own DIY hacks and learn your own weathering, but sometimes it's also really nice to be able to just open a bottle of paint and go. It's nice to be able to freehand your way through weathering, and I think one day I'll finally fully get there, but for now it's just establishing the muscle memory and good habits. And while I'm learning that, sometimes it's nice to be able to just open up a guide and go and follow the steps and make it your own. So if you're thinking about doing a weathered miniature, I highly recommend you give it a try. Everybody thinks that it's really tough to do, but there's so many great guides out there, and it's relatively cheap to get the paints and the materials that you need to make a decent weathering job. It's about practice, and it's about following the steps and learning the way that the layers work. It's amazing that you can get a kit like this that you open the box and all the paints are ready for you, except for the base chipping layer. I'm still kind of annoyed that it didn't come with a light chipping layer, even though it referenced a light chipping layer. But that's fine, that's an easy thing to work around. I do recommend this if you're just getting started in weathering and you want a nice step-by-step guide to get you started on the weathering process. This is exactly the kind of kit that I wish I had had earlier on when I was building my larger models and kind of just guessing at what it would take to make a rusty car. Now that all the streaking was done, it was time to add the bright work. I used some bare metal foil that I had in a drawer. This stuff does go bad over time. It does get pretty wrinkly, and fortunately this was a weathered car build, so I wasn't too worried about the trim looking like it had a bunch of dings in it. This is almost like a Mylar to work with, so it is much more curve hugging than a thicker duct taping would be, so it does work very well for this scale. And it does burnish out pretty well with a toothpick. I really wanted to stick with just using the rust, stain, and streaking set for the body of the car to show what kind of effects you could get with just base paints and the kit. But the hood was a different story. I wanted it to have its own weathering, and I had just gotten this Vallejo Rain Marks environment paint in the mail and really wanted to try that out. And fortunately, there are a lot of great tutorial videos out there on how to use this stuff because it comes in the mail and it's just paint. There's no real instructions on it. While Vallejo has some really great tutorials on their YouTube channel, I found a great tutorial/review from Not So Average Builder on YouTube. I'll link to his video in the description of this video. It was a great walkthrough of showing how he used the paint to get some really nice rain marks, and I used his technique for adding some highlights and some streaking. It really helped add some highlights to the fiberglass and really make it look like it had a texture beyond just being a dark gray. So thank you, Not So Average Builder, for the tip. The key here is really to work slowly and go over highlighted areas with it. It's almost more of a wash than a paint, and then as it dries, before it gets completely dried, go back over it with a little bit of a wet brush to smooth the transition of the wash-like texture that it gives and add the streaking effects with a dampened brush. And I really like how the result turned out. I can't wait to try it on my next build. Once I had the trim on, I noticed that the line between the trim and the paint was just a little too clean, so I busted out the black wash again to give it a little bit of contrast and make it look like some filth had built up between the trim and the paint of the car. Also, while I was building this, another package arrived, and it's this Green Stuff World liquid mask, and I've never really used liquid mask before on my builds. And I wanted to have the windows show a bit of a fogged effect, like where the lamination is starting to come undone on the windshield and where dust and grime have gathered in the corners. This liquid mask really makes it easy to paint in areas where the windshield wiper streaks would be. Between all this, I kept putting the parts of the car that I was working on in my food dehydrator that I picked up recently. It is a huge help to have a food dehydrator handy. You can use a toaster oven or you can use whatever you want to help aid in curing paint. For me, this food dehydrator was almost perfect for what I need as far as being able to dry paint out very, very quickly. I work in a humid environment down here in Florida. It's really nice to be able to work on part of a car and throw it in the food dehydrator and work on another section of the car. So as soon as the liquid mask was applied, I put it in the food dehydrator and got to work on the wheels. To add some wear and tear to the street slicks that I picked out for this car, I just put one wheel at a time on an axle, ran it over some 220 grit sandpaper at a low speed, and it really did a good job of quickly weathering the tread. I gave the wheels a touch of rust wash to grime them up a little bit, and it ended up drying a little too shiny, so I ended up going over them again with some gritty gray weathering powders, and that helps dull them up. I made a bit of a tactical error here with the windshield that I should have known better on. I should have known as soon as I finished applying the matte clear to the glass to immediately pull the liquid mask, but I didn't. That ended up creating a hard line on the matte clear and it almost peeled off. So I went back over it all with a dampened brush. That helped work the clear coat back into the glass, but just as a note for next time, if you're using liquid mask, just like any mask, as soon as you're done painting, pull the mask right away or you risk taking the paint with you when you pull it off later. I had yet another visit from my little workbench helper, and she felt that my workbench was lacking a certain amount of flair at this point, so she added some of her own. I had a lot of aspirations of doing more with this build, but all in all, I'm still very happy with how things ended up coming together. This casting, again, was really great to work with, and I had this great set of wheels and tires all ready to go from an M2 kit that I had bought a while back. I think it was a Torino that came with like 3 sets of drag tires, and so it was nice to have that in my arsenal ready to go. Overall, I'm very happy with how this casting turned out. Again, I'm a little disappointed with castings like this that have built-in hood bulges and scoops, so you can't really do a more stock style build, which is, where I prefer to go with a lot of these daily driven cars of the people that I like to build. But it was also fun to do the budget bruiser look of a street racer. It was time to add some gloss to all of the signals and headlights and indicators on the car. I also added a drop to the side view mirror to give it a little bit more of a glassy look. So I was digging through looking for license plates online and ended up making a massive sheet of 1/64th scale license plates for my future builds and printing them on cardstock, although I might have to do it again on decal paper because I wasn't super happy with how the matte cardstock ended up blurring the final product. So I think if I had printed this on photo paper or on decal paper, it would have turned out a lot better. I found this really cool blue and yellow 1966-1967 Alaska license plate, which I felt was perfect for a 1966 Nova. Working with the paint and the moisture and the salt and stuff that a car like this would have experienced, even if it had been well cared for up in Alaska, being up there for a couple of decades, I felt that was a really good fit for this car. So its little Easter egg is that it's an Alaska vehicle, and you can only tell that by looking very, very closely at the slightly blurry license plate on it. I gave it a little red, white, and blue Chevrolet license plate on the front. It's just a cool little promotional design that I found. And while it was only a few days, it felt like a very long journey to finally getting to where I could put the Flying V logo on the bottom of the car, give it its designation of build number 0007. Once again, here's what I started off with: a 1966, not 1963 Chevy Nova that I was able to pick up on eBay very quickly and get it delivered to my house with just enough time to get it together. And here's what we ended up with. This is the almost no-go Nova. It was quite the burst of adrenaline to suddenly realize after sitting on the wrong casting all this time that I had the wrong car, and then really quickly find a car, get it to me in the middle of a shelter-in-place order, and get everything together for it and get it out the door. And this video is basically due about an hour from now, so I've got to finish this up and get this video edited so I can get it off to you and the rest of the 3 Blind Mice builders. I'd like to thank Lee, George, and Paul for hosting the 3 Blind Mice event as they do every month. I really appreciate you watching these videos. It's been really flattering and humbling to read all your kind words in the comments, and thank you so much for liking and commenting on my videos and subscribing. It really means a lot to me when you punch all the buttons below these videos and leave your comments, and it's been really nice. I'll probably only be doing one build next month as I focus more on the diorama, and that's going to be a lot of fun. I'm really eager to dive into that. That's something I've wanted to try for a while now. Once again, thanks for liking, commenting, subscribing, all that fun stuff, and I appreciate you coming along with me for the ride. So until next time, stay fresh, cheese bags.